Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
It was close to midnight, and St. Mary's Hospital was cloaked in an unsettling stillness. The only sounds were the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant beeps of machines monitoring patients in the wards above. The corridors were deserted, bathed in the dim glow of emergency lighting. For most people, the hospital at night was a place of quiet care, a sanctuary for those fighting illness. But for James, it often felt like something else entirely, a place suspended between the living and the dead. James sat hunched over his workstation in the hospital's IT control room, sipping his fourth cup of coffee. It was his third week working the night shift, and he had grown accustomed to the solitude. He liked it, in fact. No nurses asking for computer resets, no doctors demanding patient files, just the quiet hum of machines and the occasional system alert. Tonight, like every other night, he monitored the hospital's computer systems, ensuring everything ran smoothly. The hospital had a way of feeling timeless during these hours. Time dragged, the minutes blurring into hours as James completed his routine checks. Yet, despite the monotony, there was an unease that he could never quite shake during these late hours. Hospitals were strange places at night, filled with the living, yet always in the shadow of death. James was reviewing the latest software update for the hospital's patient record system when a soft chime interrupted his focus. He glanced at the screen. An alert. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. Of all the places in the hospital where things could go wrong, the morgue was the last one he wanted to visit at night. But he couldn't ignore the alert. Temperature regulation was crucial in the morgue, and a failure could compromise the integrity of the body stored there. Still, he couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that washed over him every time he had to visit that part of the building. He grabbed his tool kit, tucked it under his arm, and made his way out of the control room. The hospital's layout was a maze of sterile corridors, with the morgue located in the lower level of the east wing, far removed from the wards and main building. As James walked through the empty halls, he noticed how different the hospital felt at night. During the day, it was bustling with nurses, doctors, and patients, a hive of activity. But now, it felt like a different world. His footsteps echoed off the polished tiles, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly, flickering intermittently, as he passed through the narrow hallways. The ICU was deserted, the beds empty, machines idly humming. Occasionally, he would pass a closed door with a solitary patient sleeping inside, a soft beat from their monitors the only indication that life still existed here. As he descended the stairwell toward the lower levels, the air grew colder, and the hum of the hospital faded into a low, constant murmur. The morgue was in the farthest corner of the basement, far away from the rest of the building, as if it were kept at a deliberate distance. It was a place no one wanted to think about, a necessity that lingered in the shadows. James couldn't help but notice the increasing heaviness in the air as he neared the morgue. The atmosphere felt different down here, more oppressive somehow. He could hear the low rumble of machinery, the faint hiss of the refrigeration units working to keep the bodies preserved. But beyond that, it was dead silent. There was no life here, only the finality of death. He approached the morgue steel door, its surface cold and uninviting, and swiped his ID card. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a groan. The temperature dropped noticeably as he stepped inside, a chill seeping through his jacket. The room was bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of overhead lights, reflecting off the polished steel of the body drawers. James walked over to the control panel on the far wall. The temperature system was showing a malfunction. Nothing major, but it needed fixing. He placed his tool kit on the counter and began working. His fingers moved methodically, adjusting the settings, replacing a few wires, and checking the diagnostics. It was routine, mundane work, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A sound broke the silence. A faint thud, like something heavy being moved. James froze, his hand hovering over the control panel. He listened intently, his pulse quickening. The sound came again, another dull thud, this time louder. He straightened up slowly, glancing around the room. There was nothing unusual in sight. The rows of body drawers were neatly sealed, the autopsy tables empty. But the sound had definitely come from this room. James walked cautiously toward the back of the room, where the storage units were lined up against the wall. His footsteps were unnaturally loud in the stillness, and the closer he got to the source of the sound, the more his nerves prickled with unease. He stopped. In front of one of the units, the cold air brushing against his face. Another thud. This time, it was unmistakable. It was coming from inside one of the body drawers. James stared at the drawer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard stories, of course, every hospital worker had. The occasional misfiled report, bodies that were declared dead but later found to have signs of life. It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare. Very rare. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. His hand hovered over the handle of the drawer, hesitating. Maybe it was just a mechanical malfunction. Maybe the drawer had shifted on its own. But the rational part of his brain couldn't shake the image of a body inside, twitching, trying to escape. Before he could make up his mind, the door to the morgue burst open with a loud bang. James jumped, spinning around to see Dr. Harris, the hospital's coroner, sprinting down the corridor at full speed. It was a shocking sight. Dr. Harris was a man in his 50s, calm and methodical, not someone who ran. Yet there he was, charging toward the morgue as if his life depended on it. "Out of the way! I've got another live one!" Harris yelled, his voice filled with urgency. James stepped back, his mind reeling. Another live one? The words didn't make sense, but the panic in Harris's voice was unmistakable. Before he could process what was happening, the coroner rushed past him, heading straight for the body drawer that had made the noise. The corridors of St. Mary's Hospital were once again filled with the quiet hum of daily routine. The sun had risen hours ago, bathing the hospital in soft, clinical light. Doctors and nurses moved briskly through the hallways, exchanging quick updates on patients. But for James, the normalcy of the day only deepened the unease he felt. He sat at his workstation, staring blankly at the monitor, but his mind was far from the routine systems checks and software updates. His thoughts were still in the morgue. He couldn't forget the look on Dr. Harris's face as he rushed past him, or the panic in his voice when he had shouted, "Another live one!" The words had echoed in James's head all night, refusing to be drowned out by sleep. What had really happened down there? James had always been a rational person, someone who dealt in codes, systems, and logical explanations. But what he had witnessed in the morgue defied easy explanation. A body, dead, or at least it should have been, had somehow shown signs of life. And it wasn't the first time, according to Harris. The coroner had said, "Another," which meant this had happened before. But how? And why? James shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Maybe he had imagined it, or maybe there was some medical explanation that he didn't understand. After all, he wasn't a doctor. Still, the sense of dread gnawed at him, and the urge to find answers grew stronger with each passing hour. He glanced over at the coffee pot. Empty. He had gone through 2 full pots already, his nerves too wired to stop drinking. He got up, stretched, and decided to take a walk. Maybe the fresh air would clear his head. The hospital grounds were quiet in the mid-morning. The air was crisp, the autumn chill biting at James's skin as he stepped outside for a moment. He found a bench under one of the tall oaks lining the walkway and sat down, trying to make sense of everything. As he stared at the yellowed leaves falling from the branches, he thought back to the morgue. He had always avoided that part of the hospital whenever he could, a place that felt more like a warehouse of death than anything else. And yet, something had come alive down there. What had Dr. Harris seen? What had James seen? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Amanda, one of the night shift nurses, walking towards him. She was bundled up in her jacket, holding a cup of coffee. "Hey, you all right?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. James hesitated. He didn't know Amanda that well, but she had always been friendly during their overlapping shifts. Still, he wasn't sure how to bring up what had happened without sounding crazy. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Just a long night." She gave him a knowing look. "I heard Dr. Harris had a bit of a scare last night." James's pulse quickened. "You heard about that?" She nodded. "Yeah. I wasn't on duty, but people talk. One of the nurses said she saw Harris sprinting down the corridor like a bat out of hell. Something about a body in the morgue, coming back to life." James swallowed hard. "Yeah, something like that." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "You were there, right? What happened?" James took a deep breath. He hadn't told anyone what he had seen, partly because he wasn't sure if he even understood it himself. But maybe Amanda could help him make sense of it. She had been working at the hospital longer than he had. "I don't know," he said finally. I saw Harris running, and then there was this body. I didn't see much, but it looked like it moved, like it wasn't really dead." Amanda's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something James couldn't quite read. "That's strange," she said, her voice more subdued. "Have you ever heard of anything like that happening before?" James asked, his tone more urgent than he intended. Amanda was silent for a moment, staring at the ground. "There are stories," she said quietly, "but no one talks about them. I think most people just write it off as exhaustion or stress. You know how it is. Night shifts, lack of sleep, the mind plays tricks." James nodded, though he wasn't convinced. "But what if it's not just tricks? What if it's real?" Amanda hesitated, then stood up, brushing the leaves off her coat. "I don't know, James. I just know that this hospital has been around for a long time, and not everything that happens here makes it into the official reports." Later that day, James found himself back in the morgue. He had no reason to be there. His work was done, and the temperature system was functioning perfectly, but something pulled him back. The room looked exactly as it had the night before, cold and sterile, the rows of body drawers sealed tightly. The autopsy tables were empty, the tools neatly arranged on the trays. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at the drawer where the noise had come from. It was closed now, just like all the others, but the memory of that thudding sound was still fresh in his mind. Suddenly, the door creaked open behind him, and James spun around to see Dr. Harris standing in the doorway. The coroner looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, his face pale. "What are you doing here?" Harris asked, his voice sharp. I just wanted to check on things," James stammered. "Make sure everything's all right." Harris stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Everything's fine," he said curtly. "No need for you to be down here. James could feel the tension in the room. Harris was hiding something. He could sense it. "What happened last night?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris's expression hardened. "You don't need to concern yourself with that. It's hospital business." "But I was there," James pressed. "I saw the body. It moved." For a moment, Harris didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes locked on James's, as if trying to decide whether or not to tell him the truth. Finally, the coroner spoke, his voice low and strained. "What you saw happens sometimes. It's rare, but it happens." James felt a chill run down his spine. "How often?" Harris didn't answer right away. He looked away, his gaze falling on one of the autopsy tables. "More often than I'd like," he said quietly, "but it's not something we talk about. People wouldn't understand." James stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "So what?" Bodies come. The sterile hum of St. Mary's Hospital had always been a constant presence, but for James, it had become something far more sinister in the past few days. The walls felt as though they were closing in on him, the once familiar routines of doctors and nurses now seeming like part of a cover-up too vast and complex for him to fully grasp. Sitting alone in the staff break room, his coffee growing cold in front of him, James stared blankly at his laptop screen. His eyes were bloodshot, the result of too many sleepless nights spent trawling through the hospital's records, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. It had been days since the incident with Dr. Harris in the morgue, and the memory still haunted him. The body that had moved, the coroner's panic, and the cryptic explanation of, "It happens sometimes." James couldn't shake the feeling that there was far more to the story than what Harris had admitted. But the deeper he dug, the more questions he uncovered. James's position in the IT department had its perks. He knew the hospital's systems better than anyone, and that included the older, more outdated databases that most of the staff had long forgotten about. These systems, though archaic, held the records of the hospital's history, dating back decades. Late one night, long after most of the staff had gone home, James sat in his dimly lit office, fingers flying over the keyboard. He had found an old access point to a decommissioned server, one that hadn't been used in years, but still contained archived reports and files. His heart pounded as he hacked into the system, bypassing layers of security that had once protected patient records and staff reports from prying eyes. At first, the files seemed mundane, old patient charts, treatment plans, routine incidents. But then, buried deep within the system, he found something more disturbing. Reports of revivals, cases where patients had been declared dead only to briefly return to life for a matter of minutes or even seconds before dying again. The language in the reports was clinical, detached, but the details were chilling. One patient, a 42-year-old man who had died of a heart attack, had suddenly gasped for air an hour after being declared dead. He had no pulse, no signs of brain activity, but for a brief moment, his chest rose and fell as if he were alive. The medical staff had been horrified, but before they could act, he had stopped breathing again, this time for good. James scrolled through report after report, each one eerily similar. The patients all exhibited the same symptoms, brief, inexplicable signs of life, followed by death. And all of these incidents had been swept under the rug, hidden in the archives where no one would find them unless they knew where to look. James didn't know how much longer he could keep quiet about what he had discovered. The knowledge gnawed at him, consuming his every thought. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him, Dr. Harris. But confronting the coroner wasn't going to be easy. Harris had already been evasive, brushing off James's questions with vague half-truths. Still, James couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Harris knew far more than he was letting on. One evening, As the hospital began to quiet down, James found Harris in his office, hunched over a stack of paperwork. The coroner didn't look up when James entered, his attention fixed on whatever he was reading. "Dr. Harris," James said, his voice steady but firm. Harris glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What is it now, James?" "I need to talk to you," James said, closing the door behind him. "About what's been happening in the morgue." The coroner's eyes narrowed. "I've already told you. I know what you told me," James interrupted. "But I don't believe you." Harris's face darkened, and for a moment, James thought the older man might order him out of the office. But instead, Harris leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Go on, then," he said, his voice low. "What exactly do you think you know?" James hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He didn't want to show all of his cards just yet. "I've been looking into the hospital's records," he said carefully. "There have been more incidents like the one in the morgue. Patients who were declared dead, only to come back to life for a short time." Harris didn't react immediately, his expression remaining neutral. And I think you know more about it than you're letting on," James continued. "I've seen the reports. This has been happening for years, decades even." For a moment, Harris said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, staring out into the darkness beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost weary. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his back still turned to James. "You think I haven't asked myself the same questions?" James blinked, caught off guard by this sudden shift in tone. "Then why haven't you done anything about it?" Harris turned to face him, his expression grim. "Because there's nothing we can do. These incidents, they don't follow any pattern we can understand. They just happen, and when they do, there's no stopping them." James sat alone in the dimly lit staff break room, the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him like an anvil. The hospital, a place that once seemed like a familiar, if somewhat mundane, environment, now felt like a breeding ground for something sinister, something no one else seemed to notice or care about. It had been days since he'd uncovered the forgotten files about the revival cases, and since then, his life had been turned upside down. Sleep was a luxury he no longer had, his thoughts consumed by the growing list of questions with no clear answers. His once cordial relationship with his colleagues had deteriorated. They sensed his growing paranoia, and whispers followed him down the hallways. The first note had been scrawled hastily on a scrap of paper, slipped under the door of his apartment. "Stop digging." At first, James had dismissed it as a prank. After all, who could possibly know what he was working on? But the phone calls began shortly after that, silent, ominous, the faint sound of breathing on the other end before the line would go dead. James wasn't the type to scare easily, but the unease was creeping into his bones. Every time he left work, he felt eyes on him. Once, he'd even caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing across the street from his building, watching him from the darkness. The figure had vanished the moment James stepped outside. Whoever was behind the threats clearly didn't want him to continue his investigation, but James couldn't stop now. He was too far in, too close to uncovering the truth. Determined to push forward, James spent hours each night in the hospital's archives, going through old records with a growing sense of urgency. The more he found, the more he realized that this wasn't just a series of random incidents. There was a deliberate pattern, a history of strange deaths and unexplained revivals that stretched back decades. In one of the oldest records, dated from the 1950s, James came across a series of reports about a medical research project conducted in the hospital's now forgotten wing. The project had been designed to study death, not just in the traditional sense, but to explore the possibility of reversing it. The language in the reports was clinical, but the implications were horrifying. Patients had been subjected to experimental treatments after death, in the hope of reviving them. Most of the patients had died permanently, but in a handful of cases, there had been brief signs of life. The report stopped abruptly in the early 1960s, and there was no indication of what had happened to the project or the doctors involved. It was as if the entire thing had been erased from the hospital's history. James knew what he had to do next. Late one night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination that bordered on reckless, James made his way to the abandoned wing of the hospital. The doors to this section had been locked for years, the area deemed unsafe for use, but James had managed to secure a keycard from an old maintenance worker who had no idea what he was giving away. The air in the old wing was heavy with dust and decay, the scent of mold clinging to the walls. The corridors were narrow, lined with faded wallpaper and rusting medical equipment that hadn't been touched in decades. As James walked further into the darkness, the only sound was the echo of his footsteps. He passed by room after room, most of them empty save for the occasional broken bed frame or shattered glass. But then, in the farthest corner of the wing, he found a room that was different from the others. The door was locked, but after a few minutes of fiddling with the old lock, it swung open with a creak. Inside, the room was cluttered with old medical files, dusty video equipment, and a large metal table at the center, stained with dark spots that James didn't want to think too much about. On a shelf in the corner, James found a collection of old videotapes, each one labeled with a patient number and date. His heart raced as he set up the ancient video player, his fingers shaking slightly as he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a hospital room from decades ago. A patient, a middle-aged man, lay motionless on a bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. James watched in stunned silence as the doctors injected the man with something from a syringe, their expressions tense. Moments later, the man's body jerked violently, his chest heaving as if he were gasping for air. But the man wasn't alive. James could see it in the blank look in his eyes. Whatever was happening to him wasn't natural. The doctors seemed unsure of what they were witnessing, and the footage cut out shortly afterward, leaving James with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He watched tape after tape, each one showing a similar scene. Patients declared dead, briefly revived by some unknown process, only to die again moments later. The expressions on the doctors' faces varied from horror to confusion, but no one seemed to understand what they were witnessing. James felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that these experiments hadn't just been medical curiosity. They had been dangerous, unethical, and possibly responsible for the strange incidents still happening in the hospital today. As James left the old wing, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His footsteps echoed in the silent corridors, but there was something else, something faint, like the sound of another set of footsteps just behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Shaking off the paranoia, James made his way back to his apartment, only to find the door slightly ajar. His heart leaped into his throat as he pushed it open, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of an intruder. Everything seemed untouched, except for the small, crumpled piece of paper on his desk. "This is your last warning. Stop now, or it'll be your last breath." James sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The hospital loomed in the distance, a monolith of cold stone and glass, housing secrets that had nearly destroyed him. He had barely slept in days, his mind racing with the revelations he had uncovered, the threats that had come far too close to home. Every shadow seemed like a potential threat, every quiet moment tinged with the unease that someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, her final warning before she had disappeared into the shadows of her own guilt. "They'll stop at nothing to protect their secret." If you push too hard, they'll make sure you disappear, just like the others. James had pushed too hard, and now he was paying the price. The meeting with Margaret had been brief and tense. She had been reluctant to say anything at first, her eyes darting around the empty cafe where they had met, as though she expected someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. But James had been persistent, and eventually she had cracked. "It's Dr. Kenneth Hollis," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. "He was one of the original doctors involved in the revival experiments back in the 50s. When the project was shut down, he disappeared for a while, but he came back, changed his name, started working under a different identity. No one questioned it. He had connections, powerful ones." James's heart had skipped a beat at the name. Dr. Kenneth Hollis, now known as Dr. Adrian Clark, was a well-respected figure at the hospital, known for his pioneering work in emergency medicine. He had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a fixture in the hospital's culture. Margaret had looked him dead in the eyes. "He's dangerous, James. You need to be careful. If he finds out you know, you'll end up like the others." Armed with this new information, James had returned to the hospital with a sense of purpose, but also with a gnawing fear that he was walking straight into a trap. Dr. Clark Hollis wasn't just any doctor. He was a man with deep ties to the hospital's past, someone who had been quietly conducting his experiments for decades without anyone questioning him. And now, James was about to confront him. It didn't take long for James to track down Dr. Clark in his office. The man was seated behind his large mahogany desk, the walls lined with certificates and awards that painted a picture of a dedicated medical professional. But James knew better now. "Dr. Clark," James said, stepping into the room without knocking. His voice was steady, but inside, his heart pounded. Clark looked up from his paperwork, his expression calm and unreadable. "Mr. Turner, what brings you to my office at this hour?" James closed the door behind him. "I know who you are. Kenneth Hollis." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Dr. Clark's mouth. "Ah, I see. You've been digging. You should have stopped when you had the chance." James took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've been conducting those experiments for years, haven't you? The revival treatments. You're responsible for the deaths, the disappearances. All of it." Dr. Clark Hollis stood slowly, smoothing down the front of his lab coat. "Responsible?" he echoed, his tone almost amused. "I prefer to think of it as advancing the boundaries of medical science. Death is merely a hurdle to overcome, Mr. Turner. Something that can be managed." James felt a chill crawl down his spine. The casual way Hollis spoke of death, as though it were a minor inconvenience, was deeply unsettling. "Those people died because of you," James snapped. "You played God with their lives, and now you're trying to cover it all up." Hollis's expression darkened. "I did what was necessary. The hospital, they knew what I was doing. They supported it for a time. But when the public became aware, they abandoned the project, left me to clean up the mess. I had no choice but to continue my work in secret." James's blood ran cold as Hollis circled around his desk, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "You, Mr. Turner, have become a problem, a nuisance. I warned you to stop digging, but you didn't listen." Suddenly, the door behind James burst open, and two security guards stepped in, their expressions grim. "Mr. Turner," one of them said, "you need to come with us. You've been accused of tampering with hospital records and conducting unauthorized experiments." James froze, the pieces falling into place. This was Hollis's plan all along. He had been set up. They were going to pin everything on him. "You can't do this," James said, backing away as the guards approached. You know I didn't do anything. It's him. He's the one behind it all. But Hollis merely watched with a detached interest, his hands clasped behind his back. Goodbye, Mr. Turner. In a moment of sheer desperation, James lunged for the door, shoving past the guards and sprinting down the hallway. Behind him, he heard shouts and the pounding of footsteps as they gave chase. His heart raced as he rounded the corner, heading toward the only place he knew he could find answers, the forgotten wing. He had to get back to the hidden labs, find the evidence that would expose Hollis for what he truly was. The corridors blurred as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the security guards closing in behind him, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. But James didn't stop. He couldn't stop.